Okay, we are now starting. Okay, welcome, Maria. Thank you very much to be with us today. We have our spa day at Nova, and Maria is talking about exchange networks and ceramic distribution in post-Roman Atlantic seaboard zone. I will pass to José Carlos Quaresma. He's going to do a small introduction about the research that Maria carries out. Thank you very much.
So, hello, everybody. So it's a pleasure to introduce Maria Duggan to everyone. Maria is a colleague and a friend of mine. We work in the same subject, so we have some interests with the same people, the same universities, same congresses. Maria is connected to the University of Newcastle, where she's doing some research. She has also made recently postdoctoral research at the British School of Athens. And she works mainly on the Atlantic shore, on late antiquity, on ceramics. She had made important, and she's doing important research on sites like Tintagel, the southern Britannia. And recently, she has published some important books and papers, for instance, in the Secretariat, other important international congresses. I should stress two recent books: the publication of her thesis, the links to late antiquity in 2018, and the proceedings of the Congress held in 2014, where I was with her in Newcastle about ceramics and the Atlantic connections, published in 2020. Recently, also, she was also invited to belong to the board of the Secretariat as a supervisor. So Maria is a very well-known researcher in the Western Europe about ceramics and late antiquity. I think it's quite important for us to hear a little bit of her work on the Atlantic shore and share with her a lot of subjects that we can share exactly between Portugal and England. So I think it will be, because I know very well the work of Maria Duggan, a very interesting lecture with interesting topics and conclusions and methodologies for us. So I think I can give you the word. Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I apologize that I'm not speaking in Portuguese. I would like to, but it's very, very nice to be asked to contribute to this seminar series. So I'm very happy to be here. I'll share my screen now, and hopefully this will work okay. So today I'm going to be talking about late Roman or Byzantine Mediterranean ceramics that are coming from the East Mediterranean principally and ending up on the Atlantic seaboard of Europe. Principally, I'm going to talk about the northern end of that distribution into Britain and how understandings of these ceramics have had an implication for our understandings of early medieval Britain more broadly. So we'll go back to these types, but just to sort of remind you, you might know some of these types. We're principally talking about amphoras, so storage or transport vessels and fine wares for dining and serving, with just a little bit of courseware. Principally, I'm going to be talking about Mediterranean ceramics, but in Britain, we also do have this slightly later phase of imports coming from continental Europe. which includes glasswares and coarseware ceramics, which we think are probably coming from southwest France, the region of Bordeaux. For post-Roman Britain, we have a sort of simplified model that splits Western Britain into the sort of surviving British population and Eastern Britain, which is increasingly coming under European Anglo-Saxon influence into the 5th and 6th centuries. Obviously, this is a model, and there's a lot of debate about the peoples of Britain and the extent of people who were arriving, but there is a division we see in the ceramics and in the artifacts more generally, and this seems to connect with two different routeways of material reaching Britain in the post-Roman period. So in the 5th and 6th centuries, we seem to have a riverine route bringing metalwares from the Mediterranean to Eastern Britain, which principally end up in burial contexts. And then we have ceramics, amphoras and fine wares ending up in Western Britain, and principally these are found on settlement sites. I should stress that neither are in great quantities. So these ceramics are seen to arrive by an Atlantic route from the East Mediterranean, somehow through the Straits of Gibraltar and reaching Western Britain. So you might be familiar with the site of Sutton Hoo in Eastern Britain. And just to stress that although this site, the burial here is 7th century, a lot of the material that's found in the burial is quite a lot earlier. So some of the silverware is coming from the East Mediterranean, like this big Anastasius platter, which is in the British Museum, is actually directly of the same date as the Mediterranean ceramics that we have in Western Britain. Just to show you what types of ceramics we're talking about a little more closely, we have late Roman C or Phocaean red slip, which is coming from Western Turkey. And everything we have in Britain at present is of one form, so variants of the form 3, which has had a big influence on the dating of this import system more generally. So it's usually seen to be about the late 5th century towards the middle of the 6th century. So about 475 to 550 with a little bit of movement on either side. We have a package of African red slip wares of broadly the same date. In terms of amphora, we've got late Roman 1 coming from southern Turkey, the northeast corner of the Mediterranean. And we've got late Roman 2, which is the sort of standard Aegean amphora of this period, with slightly smaller numbers of late Roman 3. And if you see the British publications, we have this old classification sequence called B wares, which seems to be disappearing, which is good because it causes problems sort of relating the two. Unfortunately, B1 that we have here is late Roman 2 and B2 is late Roman 1, which obviously causes complications. I only mention this because we do have this one last vestige of this B-ware sequence, which are larger amphoras. Now, these have previously been seen to be North African, and I'll come back to this, but increasingly we can see these as probable amphoras coming from southern Spain. And of course, as research is developed on the origins of these amphoras and the sort of typochronology, how these shapes of amphoras and the families of amphoras change over time, we're getting slightly better information on the dates and the sources of these amphoras. The problem that we have in Britain is quite often we have very small sherds and not necessarily diagnostic sherds, so it can be quite difficult to match to these typologically refined types. But for instance, our late Roman 1 that we commonly see seems to match in the sort of transition of this type, which again seems to put it in the later 5th and first half of the 6th century. We have a very long history of research on these imported wares in Britain. And this is a watercolour from the late 19th century from the southwest of Britain. But at the time, they didn't know the origin of these amphoras. But you can see late Roman 1 and late Roman 2 are East Mediterranean amphora types illustrated here. I don't want to go through all of these different publications, just to show you, there's been a lot of publications related to these ceramics. Because in Britain, we have very little material culture of the post-Roman or early medieval period. Certain parts of the country are aceramic. Ireland is aceramic in this period. Cornwall, there is a little bit of local production, but Devon, another county, we don't have any ceramic production. So there's been very little artifacts to help us date sites and settlements of this period. So these ceramics have had a really important dating function in British archaeology more generally. So just to show you some of the key publications from Britain, but also picking out John Hayes's seminal book, Late Roman Pottery, which really established the dating sequence and the chronologies and typologies for these ceramics that we could use in a British context. The most recent comprehensive study of these imported ceramics and associated imports in Britain was by Ewan Campbell in 2007. So you can see his distribution map of these amphoras, and you can see very well the marked concentration in southwest Britain. This is the region of Cornwall and Devon, and that very large spot in the southwest is from the site of Tintagel in Cornwall, which I've been working on in relation to the analysis of the ceramics, and which I'll come back to. But you can see there's a distribution across Western Britain and into Ireland, up the Irish Sea. But these ceramics don't really seem to be a feature of Eastern British post-Roman sites. So just to show you some of the sites in Southwest, in the region of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset and South Wales, that are quite known for having some of these ceramics, and which I'll just mention a little bit more about, principally Tintagel being the site with the most material on the north coast of Cornwall. And Ewan Campbell showed how this distribution of ceramics equates very well with concentrations of mineral resources also in southwest Britain, particularly Cornwall, which is obviously famed for tin right from prehistory. Cornwall was a key source of tin right across Europe. So it seems that in this period, we can connect a demand for tin from the Mediterranean with the arrival of these exotic ceramics. And this is the model that we have of perhaps wine or oil arriving in southwest Britain via these trading routes and being exchanged for mineral resources, principally tin, but also perhaps lead, perhaps copper from Ireland, other resources as well. But this is the model that we have. So just to sum up from this very long history of research in Britain and Ireland, these kind of standard interpretations that have developed. As I mentioned, this seems to be a new system, something different to what was happening in Roman Britain, and perhaps with some kind of gap as well. The ceramics would seem to suggest some kind of break in the early 5th century. And then that later in the century, there's a resumption of trade and a resumption of contact. As I've mentioned, this distribution being focused on the southwest. But again, I should stress that these quantities aren't great. When perhaps talking about less than 1,500 to 1,000 vessels in total, including amphoras and fine wares from the entire of Western Britain. These are not common items, but they are important, as I mentioned, in British archaeology. Mentioned that link with tin, but the sites that they're found on are principally in coastal regions, and there are some ecclesiastical sites, but there's quite a strong connection with royal sites. Tintagel, which I'll talk about, has been seen as a royal site, and a lot of the sites that have these imported ceramics are seen as regional power bases, or perhaps sites of kings of the emerging kingdoms of early medieval Britain. And in fact, about half of all of the ceramic material comes from one site, which is Tintagel. And at Tintagel, the vast majority of the ceramics found there are imported. So there's very little local material. So these imported ceramics have quite a particular function at the site. And something that I'm going to discuss quite a lot more is this older model of direct contact. So because this material was arriving from the East Mediterranean, it was seen to have been arriving directly in Britain. So you could draw an arrow from the East Mediterranean to Cornwall and suggest that there were shipments of material arriving. And this perhaps was something to be questioned, and this was the subject of my thesis. And the reason why this is significant is because there was an interpretation from that there were direct political or diplomatic links with the Byzantine state. So Britain was on the sort of radar of the Byzantine state, and that there was some reason underlying this distribution and the material arriving in Western Britain. So as I've mentioned, this was the subject of my thesis, and I'll come back to that, but just to show you some of the sites in southwestern Britain that do have this imported East Mediterranean ceramic material. So this is Bantham, which after Tintagel is the site with the largest quantity of material. And there was excavations there in 2001, published in 2011, which revealed late Roman I amphoras, late Roman II, and it was coming from beach dunes very close to the coast. So this has been interpreted as a beach market trading site. Bantham here is at the southern end of Dartmoor, which is a sort of notable tin streaming site. So the model we have is of tin being produced on Dartmoor, being brought down to coastal trading stations, where we have this exchange for imported Mediterranean luxuries, as I say, probably wine, probably oil, and also other items. Interestingly, at Bantham, I want to show you these. The imported ceramics, the amphoras and finewares, were turned into spindle whorls. So it may be that the sherds themselves had some kind of longer lasting significance to the people there. I was personally involved in excavations at Mothercombe, which is very close to Bantham on the South Devon coast, and again is potentially linked to trading sites for tin. But we think here, well, we do have evidence for large timber structures, and it may be that we have buildings where these imported commodities were being consumed on site. You can see a couple of the sherds here. I just wanted to stress again the amount of material. My background is actually working in the Eastern Mediterranean, and this is a waster pit from a project that I was involved with in Turkey of finewares. And these ceramics are literally falling out of the ground, whereas our sum total of the assemblage from Mothercombe is probably less than 20 sherds, perhaps reflecting about 8 or 10 vessels, but these aren't in very large quantities. And it's perhaps that has an impact on the significance of these items. The value of a wine amphora in the East Mediterranean in the late 5th century might not be the same as the value of such an amphora in Western Britain by the time it arrives through these systems. Cadbury Castle here in Somerset is a royal site, and just to show you the sherds themselves being displayed in the museum, because they are quite important artifacts despite being quite small ceramic sherds. And the distribution, as I mentioned, also goes into Ireland. So the largest amount of material is from a site at Garons, not too far from Cork in the southern part of Ireland. We also have the site at Dalkey Island, which is very close to Dublin, which we think may have been operating as a kind of coastal trading station. So Garons seems to be another one of these royal sites, and the site at Dalkey Island, possibly a trading site operating on the coast, perhaps in a similar way to Bantham that we saw in Devon. As I mentioned, the site with the largest quantity of this material is Tintagel in Cornwall. Tintagel also thought to be a royal site in this period, perhaps for the kings of a kingdom called Dumnonia. Unfortunately, we have very little information textually for this period at all, nothing contemporary with the ceramics. So a lot of the interpretations that we have are based on later texts, and also kind of looking at the archaeology on its own terms as well. But we suggest that this may have been a royal site in this period. The walls that you see on the site belong to the 13th century. There's a medieval castle on the site, but this is built directly on stone walls related to earlier settlement on the site. So we have all these buildings across the headland, Tintagels on a sort of island separated by a promontory from the mainland. And there are all these stone-walled rectangular buildings across the headland. And in connection with these are lots of sherds of Mediterranean amphoras. So the site here was excavated from the 1930s by Raleigh Radford, and this led to the identification of these ceramics. And work at the site was subsequently sort of taken over by Charles Thomas, who developed a lot of the interpretations of these Mediterranean ceramics more generally. So Raleigh Radford's excavations, mostly along the sort of eastern part of this headland, revealed these stone-built structures with Mediterranean ceramics in association with them. So here you can see one of these buildings, but it was more of a sort of clearance and reconstruction at the time rather than sort of archaeological excavation as we would recognize it today. So we don't have a huge amount of contextual information about how these sherds related to the buildings. There was another phase of excavation on the eastern part of the headland in the 1990s by Barrowmore, and there was a publication from that where they found additional ceramics. And they also found an inscribed stone, and another one of these was found lately. So we do know that there was some literacy at the site. There was an awareness perhaps of Latin. We also have these Greek monograms that appear on some of these inscribed stones. In 2019, a new bridge was opened linking the mainland part of the site to the headland, to the island. And you can see the older bridge beneath with this new bridge. But this actually replicates what we think the site was like in the early medieval period. So we think there was a land bridge between the two parts of the site and what they call the inner ward and the outer ward of the medieval castle, the later medieval castle. And these Mediterranean ceramics are distributed across the whole of the island part of the site and also onto the mainland part, which you can see here looking back in the other direction. There was additional work in the 1990s at the Church of St. Materianus, which is looking directly across the sea from the island of Tintagel. You can see the church there. And there were smaller amounts of ceramics found in the churchyard. So there is a spread of material extending away from the site, and perhaps here at the churchyard related to burial practices, perhaps feasting related to burials at the churchyard site. And the directors of this project were Charles Thomas, who I mentioned, and Jackie Nowakowski, who I'll also talk about, who is directing the latest phase of excavations, which will be published soon. This is looking across from the island onto the mainland and towards St. Materianus Church. And we can suggest that there might be a connection between the royal settlement site and an ecclesiastical site very close by, which is a sort of common model for early medieval Britain. So just some shots of the churchyard. And then here, looking down from the island part of the site, this is actually the harbour. And we think that certainly later on there were ships arriving in the harbour here. But it is a rocky and dangerous part of the coastline. So it might be that some local knowledge was required to allow ships to arrive here on the coast. So the imported ceramics are one of the key finds you'll see at the site. This is the visitor centre, and you can see a display of the same fine wares and amphora sherds that I mentioned, you can see the combed amphoras of late Roman II, if you know this type, which as mentioned is coming from the Aegean region. We're also with imported glasswares, the ones in the bottom left corner are the original finds. And also the rest of the material is on display or in the stores of the Royal Cornwall Museum in Truro. Here again, you can see some of the amphoras from Tintagel. And the ceramics have really been a key to understanding the site in the early medieval period. This is an old interpretation panel which has since been replaced, but you can see this model of the king at the site going down to the harbour to receive a ship arriving from the East Mediterranean laden with late Roman II amphoras coming from the Aegean, perhaps bringing wine, perhaps bringing oil. But this model was kind of how we understood the site. So as I mentioned, we have this sort of direct model of shipment from the East Mediterranean, bringing ceramics, also luxury items, possibly stopping in North Africa because we do have North African fineware ceramics, and then continuing directly through the Strait of Gibraltar, up the coast of Atlantic Europe and directly to southwestern Britain, with redistribution then to other sites in Western Britain or Scotland. So this is the model that we had. And then moving south through this system, mineral resources, metals, tin, and also organic items like wood, perhaps even cargoes of slaves in this period may have been moving through this system. So where did this model of direct shipment come from in Britain? We have publications from the middle of the 20th century, particularly a project that was done by Bernard Wales, who looked in museums in France and Spain and didn't find any parallels for the East Mediterranean material that he'd seen from southwestern Britain, like the ceramics we see at Tintagel. And this led him to conclude that shipment was direct and that there wasn't material being taken in at harbours in the Atlantic itself. And I should stress that Wales wasn't actually wrong, only that he didn't see any material. Everything he saw were different types of ceramics. Unfortunately, he didn't get to see material that I'll come back to, but clearly this model needed to be changed. So here's Leslie Alcock's Authors Britain from 1971. And again, we can see these long trails of shipments coming from the East Mediterranean, bringing finewares and amphoras directly to southwest Britain and also to Ireland. And this was a Tintagel guidebook from just a few years ago, and you can see that the same kind of transport systems are being replicated, again with this model of direct shipment, with perhaps also other imported items like glasswares coming from the Bordeaux region. We don't have any textual references to this sort of transport system, but there are connections made with a saint's life from the 7th century of St. John the Almsgiver. And in this story, St. John sends a mission sending grain from Alexandria in Egypt to southwest Britain, or to Britain, sorry, more generally, where there is a famine. And the ship comes back with tin, and on the way back, this tin is magically transposed to silver. So this is a later story, but connections have been made to this system, and this has been used to sort of prop up this model of direct connection between the two areas. So this was the topic of my PhD research, to investigate this model coming from a British perspective. And this was sort of underpinned by two main views on this material. Firstly, that there were very few similar finds on the Atlantic coast. And secondly, that the British material was unique, and it wasn't like contemporary patterns in the Western Mediterranean, and therefore required a new interpretation to explain this distribution. And this was linked to special diplomatic or political connections with the Byzantine state. So the subject of my thesis was to sort of investigate these two assumptions and to see what could be questioned. So if we look back to John Hayes's distribution of late Roman sea fineware from his late Roman pottery in 1972, we can see there's only one spot on the Atlantic coast of Europe. I think this is actually Braga rather than Connembriga, but just this one spot here. But subsequently, the finds emerging from Connembriga sort of led to a revision of this model, that there was some distribution on the Portuguese coast. However, it didn't really change this model of direct shipment, and instead the material at Connembriga, which appeared in the supplement to John Hayes's late Roman pottery, where he describes it as a spectacular new dimension, this material from Connembriga is rather seen as just a stop-off point on these direct routes to Britain. So in Mike Fulford's important article on these imported wares in Britain, which had a lot of influence on subsequent interpretations, the finds from Connembriga are described as the only notable instance of late Roman sea along the wider Atlantic seaboard. I won't read all of this out, but just this was a discussion from my thesis, showing that this distribution from Connembriga was taken to represent stopping off points, as I mentioned, but Britain was still seen to be the primary focus of contact with the East Mediterranean and the final goal of these East Mediterranean shipments. However, it became increasingly clear to me that these interpretations were based on a very restricted data set, and that publications that were coming out in Spain and particularly in Portugal weren't being incorporated into the British story or the British understandings of this material. And across the same period, there were publications, which I'll mention a couple of them, that were showing, for instance, our late Roman sea fineware, this Western Turkish table ceramics, of at least the same quantities as the sites that we're seeing in southwest Britain. So here's just some of the publications that I used in my thesis, particularly Delgado's synthesis of late Roman seawares and other syntheses like these. But I should stress this was me writing as a British researcher to change our understandings of these ceramics, because obviously Portuguese archaeologists were very well aware of these finds. So that was my intention, was to change this model from a British perspective. And you can see here it sort of culminated in Carlos Fibiau's article and a map published in 2009 showing a distribution of late Roman sea, this Phacean red slip fineware, right up the coast of Portugal and into northwest Spain as a very a relatively common find, certainly more common than it is in Western Britain. This is Paul Reynolds' map from his book Hispania and the Roman Mediterranean, where again you can see this marked Atlantic distribution of this late Roman sea fineware, with just the spots marking and the Cornish distribution, the finds from Cornwall here. We also have this distribution starting to appear in the Western Mediterranean as well. So we can see there's a very different understanding of these ceramics. And this is the distribution that I made from my thesis. So again, you can see this marked Atlantic distribution. It's a bit of a large spot. This very large spot is the assemblage from Vigo in Galicia, which is on a very different scale to the British find, certainly. And this was published by Adolfo Fernandez in 2014. And you can see the range and quantity of this late Roman sea fineware from Vigo actually exceeds the entire quantity of late Roman sea from Britain and Ireland. So there's a very different understanding based on this new distribution. And as well as this publication, there was an important publication that came out from Bordeaux in 2012 with imported ceramics of exactly the same types as we were seeing in Britain, and just a distribution of Eastern Mediterranean material and comparable imported finds right the way up the European Atlantic seaboard, particularly at coastal areas, particularly along rivers, but very much connecting to what we're seeing in Britain. So as part of my thesis research, I went to Bordeaux to see some of these ceramics. This is the walls of the late Roman settlement at Bordeaux, with a couple of the sites with this material inside the walls and a couple outside. And just to show you, it's the same type of Eastern Mediterranean amphoras and finewares. And these are some pictures that I took at the time, late Roman I and late Roman II. But also courseware coming from these excavations. This is from the Place Camille Julien excavations at Bordeaux. And I'm not really talking about that subsequent phase of continental ceramic imports to Britain, but the courseware from this site connect very well with the category of e-ware that we have, and seems to be a feature of later 6th and 7th century imports. So we can perhaps suggest that into the 7th century, there were quite strong trading connections between Bordeaux and Western Britain, and that Bordeaux perhaps becomes quite important as an export port towards Britain as well. So just to show you a couple of the other regions where I was looking at ceramics, unfortunately, I didn't get to have any research trips as part of my thesis further south, but I was very happy to go to the Recrutarii conference in Lisbon in 2016 and to see some of the same types of ceramics. And I must apologize that I'm not sure where this late Roman sea stamped vessel was from. This is just a picture I took at the time, but I was really struck with the parallels with a late Roman sea form 3 that we have from Dinas Powys in Wales, with the same or very similar kind of stamp on. So just to show you some of the more of the distribution maps from my thesis, we were looking at African red slip all the way up the Atlantic coast. And this is to show that in the late 5th and 6th century, the forms that we can kind of date to this period are quite well distributed. But by the later 6th and 7th century, there's only a restricted number of sites that have these later Mediterranean forms and variants of African red slip. So there seems to be a sort of drop off in trade into the later 6th century. And again, distribution of French fineware of the same period, again showing quite a wide distribution. Well, amphoras, again, showing this widespread Atlantic distribution. But I should also stress that none of these have been updated since I published the thesis. So there's been a lot published since that perhaps I know about, perhaps I don't know about, but certainly hasn't been incorporated into these distribution maps. So this is not the sort of the end point of this research. Personally, I haven't been cataloguing all the finds since, but I'm certain that if someone was to repeat the exercise, these maps would have changed in volume, but perhaps not in regional distribution. But the other sort of side of that argument for direct connection was that the British finds were different as well. But again, the distribution that we were seeing from the sort of wider Atlantic was very much the same types of ceramics. So these are some of the amphoras from Vigo, and again, a concentration of late Roman I amphora, late Roman II, with some additional amphoras, which we're starting to perhaps pick out in Britain. But certainly the British sites can't be described as unique. They're not exceptional. They do match with the wider Atlantic system, and that they aren't isolated. They do reflect the northern edge of a much greater Atlantic distribution of these materials. So in terms of changing interpretations, we can now suggest a model of indirect transport with the East Mediterranean. The British assemblage does seem to be distinct from patterns in the West Mediterranean, but does seem to reflect what's happening in the wider Atlantic. And this all seems to show an expansion of East Mediterranean trade into the Atlantic in the sort of from the middle of the 5th century to the middle of the 6th century particularly, but with continuity of that contact in Spain and Portugal across the break in the 5th century that we see in Britain, and then a continuity beyond that along the continental Atlantic seaboard, after which time connections with Britain really do seem to decrease from the middle 5th century. We seem to have this model of transshipment ports, and particularly Vigo and Galicia acting as a sort of primary transshipment point, perhaps until the 7th century. But as I mentioned, the imports to the north do seem to decline from the middle of the 6th century. And just starting to get a sense of differences in the distribution of this material and how this might relate to differences in import strategies or demand across the Atlantic. And perhaps a suggestion that in Spain and Portugal, the demand for tableware might be more important. And it might be that this reflects the import of other items that we don't see archaeologically, like grain, whereas perhaps in the North Atlantic, imported wine is more important, perhaps being used as sort of within feasting activities. But also, we also have these other luxury items that we don't see archaeologically, perhaps things like fabric, silk, spices, and gemstones. So I tried to model this indirect system. So you can see a material coming from the East Mediterranean and entering this system with transshipment ports on the Atlantic coast, whereby this material was moved to the northern ends of these systems through chains of intermediate contact and connection. But I think it's more sensible to see it as connected networks. And what seems to be the case is that the northern edge of this network seems to become separated from the middle 6th century or slightly later in that century, and that there's this break between these systems that I've labeled 1 and 2 here. So you can see these sort of intermediate important transshipment ports, but perhaps this system eventually breaks down. But by this time, there's also seems to be a break between the northern end of the Atlantic systems and the southern end. We were very happy to host a conference in 2014 at Newcastle, where we invited researchers working right across the Atlantic. And this is the first time that there'd really been an event bringing together people from these regions, and certainly that included British researchers, to look at the wider distribution of the same kinds of material right across the Atlantic seaboard. And this resulted in a publication in 2014, which included articles from France, Spain, Portugal, UK, and Ireland. And what was good about this is that we were starting to use the same terminology, specifically this British system we're not using anymore. We're talking about late Roman 1 rather than B2 amphoras. We're also starting to see an expanding range of types of ceramics across this area, which is perhaps telling us about a greater complexity of exchange within this zone as well. So rather than just considering the arrival of exotic material, we can think about connections between the communities of this zone in its own right. So just moving on for just the last part of this talk to show you, following on from this thesis, I was asked to be involved with the TCOP, a new project at Tintagel in Cornwall, specifically to do the ceramic analysis from this excavations in 2016 and 2017. So this is due to be published very soon, but just to show you some of the pictures, there was a new phase of excavation on the southern part of the headland, on the island part of the site. This is a picture from 2017. You can see the view across to the mainland. So this map shows a survey done of the island, which has all of these rectangular stone-built structures right the way across the island part of the site. And in 2016 and 2017, this area on the southern terrace of the island was excavated, which hadn't been excavated before. So it was a new part of the site to be investigated, and they were specifically interested in the stone structures and trying to understand what perhaps a building of the 5th and 6th century could look like. So there was this excavation. This is just to show you some of the earthworks that were excavated, and as I mentioned, directed by Jackie Nowakowski. So this is the structures under excavation. Just to show you some pictures that she kindly shared with me of these stone-built structures. And underlying all of these in an association were Mediterranean ceramics of the same type that had been found at Tintagel previously and that I've been talking about. Coming largely from midden deposits underlying this phase of stone-built structures. And this will all come out in the final publication, but there is a suggestion now that certainly these stone structures seem to belong to a later phase of activity. And what we seem to have for the Mediterranean material are these midden deposits that might be associated with feasting activity on the site. So that link between the stone-built structures on the site and the imported ceramics certainly needs to be questioned and might change over time. This is all of the material, the Mediterranean ceramics from the 2016 and 17 excavation laid out. Everything at the front is fine wares, which is only one small table here, but really is a very large quantity of material for Britain. I'm not going to go through all the results in detail because this will all be published, but just to show you that we had over 2,000 sherds of ceramics, most of which were amphoras. Again, those types that I've been talking about, late Roman I, late Roman II, but with perhaps a greater range of material as well starting to be recognised. And particularly from those midden deposits, material that was in better condition than has previously been found at the site. So I'm not going to talk about these in great detail. I just want to finish the talk really by showing you some images of the imported ceramics coming from this T-carp, these fairly recent excavations. So this is our late Roman C fineware, which I've talked about quite a lot. And you can see the differences in the decorations on the rims of these vessels. So we had perhaps 14 different vessels of late Roman C, represented by about 18 sherds. So there was a lot of vessels. Certainly for Britain, this is on its own the largest group of material from any of the sites. Here's some late Roman C again. There is also African red slip and this French fineware of a similar date, DSPA. And the decoration on some of these finewares shows you how these finewares themselves are created to emulate precious metal vessels of the same period. So the question that we perhaps have at the site now is, was there any precious metals? How were these vessels used? Were they used in the same way? The silverware perhaps was present at the site and has since gone missing, or were the people at the site using these dining vessels as best they could to emulate Mediterranean, Roman practices, or what's happening in the Atlantic? Or were they just viewed in their own right? Would the people at the site have a sort of very local understanding of what these vessels meant? And this is all questions for the future. Just to show you some of the amphoras, again, I've showed you late Roman I, late Roman II, the most larger groups of amphora, but then also this southern Spanish, perhaps Huelva region amphora that was previously thought to be North African is in quite large quantities. So I'm going to just show you these pictures quite quickly. Late Roman I amphora, here's a sherd and some of the illustrations, and late Roman II. Late Roman 3 is an amphora of the same period from Western Turkey. And as I've mentioned, these amphoras that we now think are, or some of them certainly, are coming from the southern part of Spain and the Huelva region. So these are quite large amphoras, and I've been working with Adolfo Fernandez to look at these, and it was actually Paul Reynolds who previously suggested that these North African or supposed North African amphoras from Britain could actually be Spanish. And some of the amphoras that we have are actually new for Britain. So this La Orden, Huelva region amphora is something that we haven't had before. And we also have these spikes from amphoras that we can link to the Agora M273 or the late Roman 8 or the Samosistan sort of family of amphoras. And again, that's something that's new for Britain. Just to show you quickly also, we have some amphora sherds with scratch dipinti and a sherd here that's been used with sort of notches put into it. And we also have sherds with graffiti as well, including one with this piece of Greek graffiti. Unfortunately, not enough to really understand what this meant. So as I say, all of this will be published soon, hopefully this year. But what's significant about the excavations is that there was a large program of dating, radiocarbon dating going on. And that's actually resulted in quite a tight dating bracket for the activity on the Southern Terrace in the later 5th century or first quarter perhaps of the 6th century, which ties in very well with our understandings of these ceramics from typology. But as I say, this will all be published. And then also just to mention, because I haven't really had time to talk about that today, that as well as doing that analysis for the new excavations, I was very happy to be funded by the British Academy to do a postdoctoral research project, collaborating between Newcastle University and the British School at Athens to investigate the entire corpus of material found at Tintagel over the last century, which involved petrographic and elemental chemical analysis, and that is all due to be published hopefully fairly soon. And that project is finished and the final publication should be coming out, which hopefully will give more information, not just on the material at Tintagel, but also starting to question the interpretations of how it was used and viewed at the site itself. So as I've mentioned, the quantities of fineware we have at Tintagel are really quite unusual. They're unusually high for Britain, and it may be that there is a specific demand for tablewares at the sites, at the Tintagel itself, that perhaps isn't seen at the site. So really outside of Tintagel, the finewares themselves are really quite rare, and just the odd sherd, the odd couple of sherds from other sites in the southwest. And what's quite interesting for me is how that relates to perhaps dining practices that are going on. Should we see these as communal vessels that were being used in feasting activities at the site? And also given new information on fineware production at Braga, can we see the presence of these finds at Tintagel within a sort of wider Atlantic system of dining preferences, and how does that relate to Roman practices and what's happening in the East Mediterranean? So lots of questions still to come, but I hope that gives you an introduction of some of the things that I've been interested in and the research that I've been carrying out in Western Britain and specifically at Tintagel. And as I said, more information will be coming out on both of those separate projects as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. I think it was wonderful, and we are going to open a moment to discuss and to have some questions, comments. We are not so many, so maybe we can talk freely, and all of you can ask directly to Maria your questions.
I'm not going to ask a question because for me it was everything you talk about. It was new, and I don't have the experience of that chronology. But I just want to thank you. It was very interesting, and it seems to me that the importance of a systematic work in the same subjects in the same area is always. It's the best way to do archaeology, I think. It was just a comment only. Thank you very much. I hope that someone could ask some question.
João has a question.
Okay.
May I? So first of all, thank you for your communication. I'm beyond myself because I really hold this line of investigation very close to my heart because I'm doing a PhD about the trade relationships of Porto during the early Middle Ages. And it's remarkable how similar Cornwall and the Atlantic seaboard is to Porto and to Vigo and everything. I had one question because even though it's remarkable that there's the maintenance of these trade routes in the East Mediterranean Atlantic direction, there seems to be an opposite trade route in the Atlantic seaboard, right? So I am convinced that I have recently found a couple of eWare shards in Porto that I had no idea there were any. So it's kind of new. And so I wonder, considering that during the 5th and the 6th century, there's the maintenance of this well-established trade network that is the Roman traditional one, what moved these Atlantic people to have their own Atlantic routes? I mean, would I be too bold to assume that there were some kinds of goods that they just couldn't find in the Mediterranean, being Anglo-Saxons and Franks and Suebi, and then maybe they had like preference for Germanic goods or something? I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that's extremely interesting. I didn't really want to talk about eWare so much, but yeah, we do know that there are some eWares, like, as you'll know, at Vigo, and the idea that there might be any more further south is really fascinating. We're in communication still with colleagues in France, and we are hoping to sort of develop some of that work on eWare. So that would be really interesting to know more about. So we should definitely stay in contact. That'd be really good to hear more about that. I think the Atlantic systems more generally, I don't think they ever stop. You know, this is a system that we know right from prehistory, and I think there's a continuity of contact and exchange both locally and sort of super regionally right through time. And I think what we see at particular times where the material culture is most visible, and I think this sort of wave of East Mediterranean material reaching Britain is just a particularly visible reflection of a system that's always operating with goods flowing in both directions. In terms of longer distance transport of materials moving south, we can certainly suggest organic materials. We know that there's this demand for tin, certainly, and we have roughly contemporary, very large spoil heaps for copper in the East Mediterranean. And there has to be a consequent tin for that as well. So there's potentially other sources, but it's probable that Cornwall is just a source of raw materials from right the way from prehistory. And as I say, it's this particular point in time that's marked out by these ceramics, but also, you know, a vast array of other things, and maybe wood, dogs even, you know, we know that there was an interest in Irish dogs. So there might be all sorts of things. Unfortunately, possibly the material heading south is more difficult to pick up. But then the other side of that is that the ceramics themselves probably aren't the key cargo as well. They're sort of the containers and the sort of archaeologically visible element for that as well. So wine probably is more important to Britain, but is grain getting further north, or other sort of bigger commodities as well? So yeah, so I think, and I think that the comment beforehand also, this research really can only be done collaboratively and between countries, and the sort of the nuances of these trading systems can only really come out of bigger systematic studies and communication across these zones as well. So does that sort of answer?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Maria.
Hello.
Congrats, first of all. Thank you for your presentation. I wonder if you can answer my question, because you told us that you are collaborating with Adolfo Fernandes. And is there any trace of Vigo amphora in Britain?
Not that I've seen.
Okay.
I have been looking out for sort of oddities in the Tintagel assemblage.
Okay.
But I mean, I should stress that there might be material that I haven't seen yet. So certainly I've seen very little material from Ireland, and Ian Doyle has been working with a lot of the material over there. And it might be that there's unrecognized amphoras in those groups as well. And I think we've had this sort of strange B5 group as a bit of a catch-all for amphoras that weren't recognized as being East Mediterranean types, late Roman 1 or late Roman 2. So the material from Tintagel that's been previously classified as B5 is quite varied, actually. Unfortunately, there's not huge amounts of diagnostic material. So we do think we've got these sort of La Orden type amphoras and possibly other sort of Spanish amphoras. But I haven't seen anything like the sort of Tipo Vigo or this kind of thing, you know, but maybe hopefully these things might appear. But I think it's this kind of starting point. I think this recognition that the British material is much more varied, and possibly anything that there is in Vigo or around the sort of the Atlantic seaboard more generally, there's no reason why it wouldn't be in Britain as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone? I don't know if Katerina, do you want to?
Want to do a question, a silly question, sorry.
Yeah.
Of someone that doesn't know much about ceramics of this kind. Do you see any relation? You show us some sites. Obviously, they are seaboard sites, and some of them, one of them was related also to a church. Is there any relations between this kind of commerce, circulation of these ceramics with the origins of the Christianism in this area?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a silly question at all. It's something that I haven't talked about largely because it's not really my background isn't really working in Britain, and sort of what's happening in terms of the appearance of Christianity in Britain is difficult to get a handle on. But yeah, certainly it's the same period. We do think there is perhaps a surviving element of Christianity in Britain, but certainly this period is when Christianity is arriving with force in Western Britain. And it may be that, say, these imported wines or oils are being used in the liturgy. That's something that's been argued. The cross stamps on vessels have been related to sort of Christian preferences. And certainly we do see the same imported ceramics you know, we've got this site at St. Materiana's near Tintagel, but also burial sites as well. But for me, the sort of the more majority of the sites seem to be connected to developing power structures. But I think what's interesting is this period that there is a sort of interplay between the two. There's a royal site and there's a church site, and it's not as easy to sort of separate them. So yeah, exactly. It's a complicated one, and I think this church is probably certainly involved, and perhaps directly within the trading itself. But how that plays out in Britain is something that I think we need to try and find out more about as well. But yeah, certainly, I think you're right.
Obviously, there is in other areas a relation in the earlier churches between elites and people with power, local power, or even more than local power, and Christianity, churches, and obviously the consumption of exogenous materials. Could be obviously ceramics, but they are consuming other things too, and the other things that are in the ceramics. The question, obviously, I think maybe in Britain also happens what happens in other places in the Mediterranean and even in the Iberia. The question is, do you think the idea of Christianity arrives to Britain with these materials? It comes from both?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, we have these models of saints arriving and Christianizing the countryside, but perhaps more everyday connections between people would also be significant within that as well. And those kind of sites where we have a connection between an external population and the locals, so maybe at these beach market sites, or I mentioned Dorky Island, sort of trading stations, or these kind of sites might be where those kind of connections happen. But yeah, it's difficult to sort of get a sense of that. But yeah, certainly it may well be that. I mean, for me, my understanding of the materials seems to be suggesting a connection with the Atlantic much more than the Mediterranean. So if there is a connection with Christianity, it's being sort of directed through the same indirect channels as well. So once hopefully we get a better sense of how material moves, we can then start to think more about the sort of cultural and social connections as well.
Yeah, thank you. There is another question of Ruth Cabrish.
Hello. I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting to see this deconstruction of the one-way route in trade from the east, and seeing that actually there were more stops on the way that are very related. So I know the focus of your presentation is mainly on coastal sites, because there's mainly where we can see these sorts of imports. But I was just wondering if there is, maybe this is a silly question out of my lack of knowledge, but if there can be traced some sort of relationship with the coastal sites and the inland sites.
Yeah, not a silly question at all. Most of the sites that we have are coastal, or they're connected to rivers, and this is probably because the appearance of the materials is reflecting the sort of the trade of other things. So, you know, they've got the sites close to Dartmoor, but I've just done the analysis of a site in Cornwall, which is about as inland as you can get in Cornwall, with for Britain quite a large assemblage as well of exactly the same kind of material. And there are certainly other sites that are further inland. I won't go back and show you, but on the map there's a site at her name's just gone out my head since I started talking about it. But basically, there's a Pictish royal site in Scotland, which is miles from the coast, and they have some amphoras, late Roman 1, late Roman 2, just a few of them. Rhynie, it's a site at Rhynie. It's a Pictish royal site, and those amphoras have certainly got to be transported overland. So they probably have some kind of value, and it's probable that there's these sort of connections between power sites, royal sites, and regional power bases, and that there's probably gift exchange going on with the wine. So it might be that there's a kind of drop off as you get further inland, but certainly there are connections further inland as well.
Thank you.
So if we don't have any questions more, last chance. Ask Maria. You can, Ruth and João, you can be in connection with Maria if you want. I think, sorry, Maria, to do this bridge between you.
No, really, please do. I'd love to hear more.
Rodrigo.
Talk about silly questions. Sorry for my ignorance, but why this demand to focus on Cornwall, and why do you? What reasons can you give me for this commerce, Atlantic commerce, not to reach the eastern part of Great Britain?
I think that, you know, it's the old model of tin, and the mineral resources of the southwest are really key to that distribution. The more I see of Tintagel, it does seem very different to the other Western British sites as well. So it's a kind of unusual place. So you can't really use it as a type site for Britain. And in the past has been suggested that there might be some kind of official organization connected to it being there, which might, you know, come back in as a kind of favored interpretation as well. And so I think the other distribution that we see is probably as a result of redistribution from Tintagel or like Bantham as kind of key nodes for that system. And I think that probably is quite linked quite strongly to mineral wealth. There is some interface in terms of artifacts between Eastern and Western Britain. The problem we have with these ceramics is that we don't have late Roman I, late Roman II clearly identified in Eastern Britain. We do have some of the Eastern Mediterranean material coming from urban sites in sort of late Roman period urban sites in Britain, but they're very difficult to kind of say, is it around, you know, 400, is it around the early 5th century, or could it be later in that century? And it might be also just because of the scale of the assemblages in the East that we're not picking these out. But by and large, there does seem to be a bit of a barrier that this connection is with the West and not really with the East of Britain. I mean, my kind of pet theory, which I've seen other people talk about, is that those kind of silverwares that they have in Eastern Britain might have come from the West rather than necessarily just from the continent as well. So it might be that some of the material that was in Western Britain ended up moving into Eastern Britain. But there does seem to be a bit of a barrier, certainly in terms of ceramics. And every time I see something published from the East that might be of this type, it seems to be that it's sort of Palestinian amphoras. It could be things that could be 4th century, could be early 5th century. But I don't see any reason why not. It's just that we don't really have them. I mean, that site in Rhynie in Scotland is the furthest eastern site that we have with this Mediterranean material. And I think it's quite likely that that's come from the West Coast. So there is a bit of a spread of material up the channel, but there really does seem to be a bit of a barrier. And exactly why that is, I'm not really sure. It's possible that it's cultural, it's possible sort of economic, or it might be just, as I say, reflecting that presence of minerals in the Southwest.
Thank you.
João, it's your last chance, last call.
So one last question. So Maria, you mentioned that you had late Roman amphorae with graffiti in Greek, right? So in Porto, I have found as well a shard of late Roman amphorae 1 with an inscription painted in it, and I believe it's in Greek. This isn't surprising considering they come from the Eastern Mediterranean. But the thing that surprises me is that, if I'm not wrong, Vigo type amphorae also have inscriptions, and they're in Greek, right? Which is surprising because they're produced in Lusitania, probably. So what does this mean? Is there a community of Levantine amphorae producers or something?
I think there's actually quite strong suggestion that there might be an Eastern connected community of Vigo or in sort of around that area. I think that there quite likely is some kind of station that's sort of orchestrating these connections further north. I mean, the one we have is a late Roman 3 with a sort of cursive Greek inscription. We do have others. Late Roman ones tend to have sort of little monograms on, but we have this new stone, which I didn't show today, but will be in the new publication, which it's a sort of practice piece inscribed stone, which has a Brittonic name on, it has Latin, and it has Greek monograms as well. So there certainly seems to be some awareness of Greek. And, you know, is that just because this material is coming from East Mediterranean? Is it because of, you know, shipments arriving and sailors from the East arriving in the Atlantic somewhere on one of these intermediate ports? Or is it because there's actually a community active within the Atlantic? And I think the latter might well become sort of the favored interpretation. Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to hear more.
Thank you.
So if there is no questions, we are going, well, it's almost, we are at the same hour, so it's almost 7 o'clock in the afternoon. So thank you very much all. Thank you a lot, Maria, for this hour, for this conference. And well, it's very good. We can try again if you want. We could talk about other things because there are lots of interest in these connections and in these relations across the Atlantic. So thank you very much. Thank you all. I'm going to send you the record of the conference, and we see you now next September. We are going to have a pause in our spa, and we are going to return in September. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.